You are now listening to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors and ex-examiners who are masters of IELTS preparation. Your host, Ben Worthington.
IELTS Writing, enhancing your vocabulary. In this tutorial, we're going to first look at the criteria. Then we're going to look at 10 common words that we might find in our IELTS essays. And I'll give you a suggestion to improve each of those 10 words. And hopefully you can use this pattern to go through your essay afterwards and look for upgrades as we've done in previous tutorials. Then at the end of the tutorial, I'll give you just a few tips about how we can attain this level and how to best execute or implement the suggestions that I've been giving you. Right, so let's first have a look at the criteria. So, as I said, one of the criteria which helps the examiners judge your work is the breadth of your vocabulary. Now, we all know, hopefully, that the other three criteria is task achievement, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy. In this tutorial, as I said, we're going to look at lexical resource. So if we look at band 9 criteria, we can see it says uses a wide range of vocabulary with very natural and sophisticated control of lexical features. Rare minor errors occur only as slips. So an example of this would be flair. Okay, if you've got so much control with the language that you can just make it sound so much more eloquent. And we can see this especially in The Economist. In some journalists write like this. The Economist definitely does, and you can see there's a bit of character. There's some strength behind the writing, and it is quite difficult to pull it off. So unless you're 100% confident about that, be careful. I think it's quite a danger zone because we can aim to sound really sophisticated, but if there's one small or slight grammar error, it can really mess it up and it can really make it difficult to read, which is why in the course, in the online course, I always go for communication first. Because I think a lot of us are not at a band 9 level, so this is why we need to go for communication first, and then occasionally if there's a student around a band 8 or a band 9, I'll try and implement some of these sort of like sophisticated techniques. But that reminds me, at the end of the course, actually the online course, there are some easy to implement stylistic elements that do improve your writing. They're quite easy to implement. So band 8 lexical resource criteria says uses a wide range of vocabulary. So this goes back to what I said before, like a good process to implement when you are reviewing your essay after you've written it is look for repetition. I can't say how many times I see a student, they successfully use a phrase or an expression or a term, and then they'll repeat it twice, 3 times, and we're not going to get more points. So review your work, and if you see this repetition, try and change it, try and modify it, and look for an alternative way. And the next point, fluently and flexibly, lexical resource. Fluently and flexibly to convey precise meanings. Okay. So there's no ambiguity when we're explaining what is happening. Skillfully uses uncommon lexical items, but there may be occasional inaccuracies in word choice and in collocation. Okay, so there is a small margin for error. It's only small though, and it shouldn't really affect the communication about what's been said. And the final point, produces rare errors in spelling and or word formation. Now, I personally believe that spelling mistakes are unacceptable because you can work on this yourself. You've got the technology to implement and to correct and to improve your work by yourself. You know, you could just type it up and you see the mistakes, then you make a list of all the spelling mistakes, and then you just translate it from your language into English, and then just keep going backwards and forwards until you get it perfect. It's just a case of repetition. Now, band 7 uses a sufficient range of vocabulary to allow some flexibility and precision. This is why I go for simplicity and communication, because it's here we're only asking for some flexibility and precision. Next point, uses less common lexical items with some awareness of style and collocation. This is where the C2 framework really comes in, because they're quite easy to adopt and you're going to use them in a correct way because it's there in structure. Final point, may produce occasional errors in word choice, spelling and or word formation. Okay, so as I said before, really there should be no excuses for the spelling, but may produce occasional errors in word choice. It's forgivable. Now, while we're on the topic of word choice, let's jump straight into looking at some of these terms and looking at the words and suggesting alternatives. Now then, so first one, say. This is quite a common word. Like, for example, opponents of globalization say that it destroys local cultures. Ecologists say that climate change will make life on Earth unsustainable within 30 years. What could we use instead of say? Well, sometimes it's better to be more precise. I'll give you an example. Opponents of globalization argue that it destroys local cultures. Ecologists have suggested that climate change will make life on Earth unsustainable within 30 years. So, as I said before, when we're reviewing our work, we've finished writing the essay, look through it and look for simple words that you think we could substitute or upgrade for better ones, for more precise alternatives. Next word, fast. Instead of fast, well, have a think. I'll give you the word. I'll give you the sentence. Technology has changed very fast in the last few years. What could we say instead of fast here? Well, we could say rapidly. Technology has changed very rapidly in the last few years. Rapidly provides a slightly more formal tone. And an additional reason why we want to do this upgrading is because oversimplified vocabulary can give the impression of an oversimplified argument, which goes back to what we were saying before about the sophistication, writing with a sophisticated tone. Number 3, changed. And this is quite easy, I thought. And this is such a common verb, change. So if you see change in your vocabulary, look for ways of how we can upgrade it. So technology has changed very rapidly in the last few years. So change, as I said, is quite common, it's quite vague. So we could use developed. Technology has developed very rapidly in the last few years. This implies a more organized or planned change. Next one, last few. Yeah, technology has developed very rapidly in the last few years. It's okay. Last few, it sounds okay. It's casual. It's approximate. Yeah, it's more like spoken English, a little bit vague. as well. If we say technology has developed very rapidly in recent years, another upgrade, and it sounds slightly better. And of course, it's only a couple of words we've changed. However, all of these small changes, eventually they add up. We stack the deck, so to speak. Like a small change here, a small change there, a small change there, and suddenly we're looking at a 20% improvement in the essay. Next one of my favorite words to change is very. Okay, especially if we're doing IELTS Academic Task 1. Now, if we could say there's been a very fast change over the last few years, it'd be much better if we said there was a rapid change over the last few years. Oh, there's an extremely rapid change. Can you see? Extremely sounds so much better. Now, in the example, we could say, well, I've seen sometimes with essays that the students might put it in capitals, okay? And you might laugh, I do. But when someone sees it written in capitals, it has the effects of shouting, yeah? And of course, we don't really want to be shouting at the examiner. So what we could say instead is incredibly, yeah? Or even just find a better verb, a more descriptive one. Like, let's see, there's a very bad increase in crime. Yep, there's a significantly dangerous increase in crime, or there's a dangerous increase in crime. Slightly different meaning, but it sounds much better than a very bad. By the way, just as a bonus point, as I've said before in previous podcasts, but other words to look for are good and bad, big and small, and the verb to be and the verbs to do. Anyway, now let's look at 5 words which we could add to the writing with helpful results. So the first is whereas. This helps to organize a sentence contrastively with a minimum of fuss. Ian uses the same words over and over again, whereas John has an extensively developed vocabulary. I've done a whole podcast about this before, about using these conjunctions, comparative conjunctions, whereas, and they're very useful, especially again for IELTS Academic Task 1, where we have to compare different features. So we could say grain stocks grew significantly in 1991, whereas in 1992 they dropped to below 30,000, full stop. Beautiful comparison there, very simple to use. Another useful organizing word is conversely. Now, this word would usually come at the beginning of the sentence to imply a matching contrast with the previous sentence. So, opponents of immigration have argued that it places too much pressure on scarce resources. Full stop. Conversely, migrants themselves have complained that they are often denied access to necessary facilities. Once again, this is very simple to implement, very useful. Look at me using very. So, once again, this is extremely useful for your task 2, as I've just shown, and extremely useful for IELTS Academic Task 1. And we can use it very much in the same way as we've used whereas. Obviously, we're going to have 2 different sentences here. So, conversely implies both a contrast and a match between 2 adjacent sentences. So, this goes back to what we were saying with, let's see, skillfully uses uncommon lexical items. Yeah, we're approaching the band 7 and 8. Obviously, not just using that, it has to be used effectively, it has to be used correctly, but we're approaching that level, especially if we can employ sophisticated features consistently and accurately. Next one. Nevertheless, I had a friend, Alex, at university who used to stick this word in. He's from Halifax in Yorkshire. But anyway, he used to stick this word in his essays all the time. And he overdid it. And I was like, why do you keep using that? He goes, oh, it just sounds posh. And to a certain degree it does. But it's much better if we just use it once, we use it accurately, we use it successfully. So nevertheless is a word which helps to produce both contrast and cohesion in your argument. So it kind of goes back to these connectors that a lot of students seem to get obsessed about. I'll give you an example. Opponents of immigration have argued that it places too much pressure on scarce resources. Nevertheless, most economists continue to believe that immigration supplies further resources as well as consuming existing ones. So nevertheless does two things at once. It connects and contrasts the second sentence with the first. Connects and contrast. Does that sound similar to cohesion and coherence? Yeah? Sequences information and ideas logically. Band 8, cohesion and coherence. Or Band 7 logically organizes information and ideas. There's a clear progression throughout. So, nevertheless, connects and contrasts the second sentence with the first. Here's a challenge. Hopefully you're writing these down, but why not, while the information is fresh in your head, why not write a few essays or an essay using these instruments immediately? That's what I find is one of the best learning techniques. You just implement immediately as soon as you're aware of it, and obviously try and get feedback on that. Show it to a friend, show it to a native English speaker, send it in for correction with us, your choice. But if you can implement and execute as soon as hearing this, then we've transformed, it's basically changed from information to transformation. And that's what we're looking at here at IELTS Podcast. We're going for a transformation. I'm giving you information now, but unless you do something, it's not going to be a transformation. Let's move on. Expanding your vocabulary. Alternatively offers us a way of introducing a different angle on a particular question. Let me give you an example. Renewable energy supplies must be developed if advanced industrial societies are to prove sustainable. Alternatively, it could be argued that we should all learn to use less energy. Alternatively is less abrupt and a more precise way of beginning a sentence. Or, instead of using or. You see? So, let me just say that again. Alternatively is more precise than simply starting your second sentence with or. Yeah? Renewable energy supplies must be developed if advanced industrial societies are to prove sustainable, full stop. Or, could be argued that we should all learn to use less energy. Once again, hopefully you picked up on that when I use an or, it sounds more like a spoken English. The spoken vernacular, the spoken lexicon we use. Whereas if I use alternatively, just upgrade it. It sounds more sophisticated, and then later I can use or if absolutely necessary, if I don't have any more alternatives. Final one. one word which can be very useful in constructing your argument is empirical. Now, those on the online course might be smiling now, because this is one of the words that I've picked out. And if you look it up in the Cambridge English Dictionary, you'll find it's a C2 word. Now, in the Common European Framework, C2 corresponds to, I think it's band 8 or band 9. So this is why we've put it in our framework for our essays on the online course. And there's like example sentences where you can very easily include it. So empirical means that it's derived from or pertaining to experience. So an empirical argument is not one from first principles, but from observation of the facts. Now, this strengthens your argument considerably if we're using empirical. So a good way to use empirical is in a contrast. Let me give you an example. Arguments from first principles suggest that referendums ought to be the most direct form of democracy. However, empirical observation, that's beautiful collocation there. However, empirical observation suggests that this is not always the case. So this would be good maybe at the beginning of your paragraph. Yeah. However, empirical observation suggests otherwise. And now you can just put in a different argument or the direct contradiction of what you just said, and then go on to build the rest of your paragraph, which is quite straightforward if you're using the sentence guide structure. So please, I hope you have been writing these down. Let me just give you a quick review of those last 5, because I think they're very useful. So the first one is whereas. Helps you to organize a sentence contrastively. Number 2, conversely. This implies a contrast and a match between 2 adjacent sentences. So we say one, and then if we want to build on this, but from a slightly different view, we can use conversely. Number 3, the famous nevertheless. It connects and contrasts the second sentence with the first. These definitions, very succinct, that I'm giving you, very useful to put on your cheat sheet. Next one, alternatively. This is a more sophisticated way of saying or, and we can use this at the beginning of the sentence to start our second sentence. And the final, my favorite, is empirical. So in this example, we used empirical as a contrast in the sentence. We used it as a contrast, and empirical just means observation of the facts. So it's slightly more objective. And we used it in this case in the collocation of empirical observation suggests that global warming is growing significantly. Now, we're approaching the end. So the final tips that I'd like to mention are, number 1, more complexity is not always better. This goes back to what I said right at the beginning, where when we're using these devices, we need to be very confident, extremely confident, supremely confident that we are using them effectively and that they do not hinder or discount or take away from the point you want to communicate. And as I've said before, first we need to be concerned with communicating our argument effectively. And simplicity is usually the best way to do this. However, if we write very simple and direct, we're not going to score points. So this is why it's a careful balance, a beautiful dance between writing in a clear and effective manner, and also a little bit sophisticated and with a little bit of flair. And this is why the framework in the sentence guide is quite useful and quite straightforward to get that balance. Now, if you do try and fill your essay with complicated words, it's going to look like you're stuffing, like your word stuffing. And you're not going to come across as a very accomplished writer. But you're going to look as though someone is just trying to, take a shortcut and just stick in these idiomatic phrases because they watched a YouTube video about idiomatic phrases or whatever. And it's not going to be very effective. So we have to use them carefully. I guess you could say it's a bit like cooking. We've got to sprinkle some salt on there, but too much salt, it's just going to destroy the whole dish. Finally, an accomplished writer is an accomplished reader. Someone who knows the precise meanings of words and when and how to use them. So this goes back to what I was saying before, that to get to this level, I strongly suggest complete immersion into the language to a point where you are thinking in English. And if you make this your priority, rather than passing IELTS, rather than preparing for the exam, it might sound strange that an IELTS tutor is saying this, but if you make it your priority for a few months, then coming to prepare for the exam will be much, much easier because you'll have a more natural feel for the language when you're using it, when you're reading, when you're listening, when you're speaking and writing, you're going to have a more natural feel. And secondly, it's going to make your preparation much easier. Now then, final point. Immersion is quite difficult. So I would strongly suggest, especially for those in non-native English speaking countries, because it's difficult to get a job where you're in an environment that's forcing you to think and operate in the language. So to those students who are not in an English speaking country, get a book that's going to be addictive for you. Something like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, or if you really want to go for the best writers, you can go for George Orwell, Jane Austen, Marilyn Robinson. These are the best because they write good stories and they get you hooked. And once you're hooked, you just keep reading and reading and reading. So that's my final point that I want to make. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you want more help, if you want to pass the exam quickly, go to IELTSPodcast.com, have a look at the online course that we have there. You'll be able to see the chapters, the sentence guide framework. You'll be able to see the amount of essay corrections it comes with. You'll be able to have a look at the speaking confidence course as well, and the reading course. And if you are worried about working with us, then you can always get the trial essay correction. And that's sort of like a small step in the procedure to starting to work with us. And also, there's also the standard essay correction service. So, hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and I wish you all the best regarding your preparation going forward. You can do this. Just keep letting it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to IELTSPodcast.com.